Hello and welcome to the weekend update. So in this video, I'm going to look at Apple, Microsoft, Nvidia, Tesla, and Meta. So we'll start off with Apple. So Apple was down around 2.3% for the week. You're looking at the daily chart. Now, there hasn't been any change from last week. After the earnings was released, it fell sharply and it's now below the daily 20 and 50 moving averages. You can see that. So the price action definitely is weak. If you look at the daily momentum indicators, they're also quite weak. You can see MACD has now moved below the zero line right here, and RSI has fallen below the 50 level. So momentum indicators are also weak. Having said that, I will say that shares are oversold. You can see RSI around 30. Last time when RSI was at this level, this was back in when was it? In late December, and then it started to move higher. So there is opportunity for a bounce right here, but it doesn't mean that it starts going to all-time high again. Bounce could very well mean just moving up to these levels, the moving average, and so forth. Because as I said, the price action is weak, the momentum indicators are weak, and usually it takes few weeks for it to consolidate. We're going to look at the weekly chart, and then we'll talk about time frame levels and so forth and so on. But on a daily time frame, I'm seeing price action, momentum indicators are weak, but they are oversold, so we can't rule out some kind of a bounce fairly soon. So let's look at the weekly chart. So this is the weekly chart, and what we see is two weekly red candles, and what we see, it's now at the weekly 20 EMA. Now, since I've mentioned this last week, I'm going to say it again. Since the rally started, from early January, it formed a weekly higher low right here. There was weekly consolidation, and there was nothing else. It just went straight up. So this pullback is likely going to find a weekly higher low, just like this. Maybe it wants to do something like this, and then form a base right here, and then it wants to do something like that. It's entirely possible. The other thing is that it's now touching the weekly 20. Now, if you look to the left, after the shares were rallying from COVID sell-off, this is the COVID sell-off, a big rally, and then it would pull back to where? The weekly 20. Rally, weekly 20. Rally, it undercut the weekly 20, and then rally, weekly 20. So it has touched the weekly on a number of occasions. Even if you go to the, further back, you'll see that, from time to time, it touches the weekly 20 or 50, the case may be. So it's quite normal for it to touch the weekly 20. It could, if it wants to have a deeper correction, then it could pull back to the weekly 50. So let's see how it deals with it on the weekly 20. So that's point number one, that it is now in a zone that, maybe it can go a little bit lower, as was the case right here, or the case right here. But be that as it may, but during these pullback, one thing is that RSI basically held the 50 level. You see right here, it pulled to the 50 and then bounce, pulled here and then bounce. Even before, when this happened, RSI remained above the 50. The 50 level is the green line, and this is a very, very important level. You don't want to see RSI fall below and remain below the 50. It can fall below for a short period of time, as was the case right here. For 1 week, this red candle basically pushed it below the 50, but then this green candle basically reclaimed it. So at the moment, RSI is above the 50. It was overbought right here. So this pullback has brought it close to the 50. So you can see that 50 area was a resistance here, was a support here. What you don't want is fall below 50 and hang around below the 50. That basically means that it will correct for a longer period of time. But as long as the 50 level is held from a weekly perspective, I think that should be fine. So on a weekly basis, I'm not seeing any significant deterioration either in the price action or in the momentum. They seem fine. And what we're seeing is very reasonable based on what we've seen in the past. So given that, what are some of the levels we should be looking out for? So let me just zoom out so you can see the levels clearly right here. So you can see that Apple had traded between these two levels right here. And it has now broken below this level. So if you take this range and then double it to the downside, you get this level, which is around 175-ish. So that would be the downside I'm looking at. It doesn't mean that it touches this and bounces. It could very well do this. It could very well rally a little bit and test this level and then do that. I'm not sure what the path is, but this would be an area of interest as far as I'm concerned, because that would basically complete this range. So that's the level I'm looking at on the downside. Now, if it breaks below, then obviously we need to come up with additional targets on the downside. But I'm looking at this one as a possible downside target, which is around 175. But as I said, shares are oversold. I think it would be quite normal to expect some kind of a rebound. Now, when do we know when the daily pattern starts to turn positive? A couple of things. First of all, you want to see that the price has moved back above the 20 and 50 EMA. You want to see it's gone up and it's now above the moving averages. So that's number one. Number two, you want to see RSI reclaim this 50 level. You can see right here, RSI moved above the 50 level and it remained above all this time, and you see positive price action. So you definitely want to see something like this, reclaiming the 50 level. So this is a must. And then you want to see MACD curl and then start to move higher. So when you see that, that's when you see that the daily structure is now beginning to look positive. But we're not there yet. RSI is well below the 50, MACD is still moving, not seeing any kind of turn. Now, generally, when when it consolidates, if you look at it here, this consolidation basically was about 4 to 5 weeks. You can count the candles, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and then it starts to move higher. If you look at this consolidation, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, there were number of weekly candles. So even here you can see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and then starts to move higher. Usually you see consolidation lasting for 4 to 6 weeks. It doesn't mean that it's going to fall for 4 to 6 weeks. It also could mean basically going sideways for a few weeks. So that's basically that's when you know that it's beginning to form a base. So right now it's only just 2 weekly candles. So maybe it needs to consolidate a little bit more. Go sideways, go up a little bit, pull back, so forth and so on, and reset the weekly indicators. So that's my view on Apple. I'm seeing weakness on a daily time frame. I'm not seeing any kind of serious breakdown on a weekly time frame. It is oversold, so I think there is an opportunity for a bounce. We'll see the quality of the bounce and then take it from there. So and generally, as I said, consolidations last for 4 to 6 weeks. It's been a couple of weeks, so they may be, so there, it is entirely possible for it to kind of base, move sideways, do that kind of things over the next couple of weeks before all the indicators reset themselves, and then we start to see Apple move higher. So that's basically how I see things play out. Now you can follow me on Twitter. I mean, obviously, if I see something other than that, I definitely will tweet out because I don't make these videos on a daily basis. So you can follow me on Twitter just to see if I'm seeing anything positive or negative on Twitter. So that's Apple. Let's move on to Microsoft. Daily chart, similar to Apple. So on the whole, it's down around 13%. How much is Apple down? Apple is down around 11%. For Apple, that's quite big. Apple usually doesn't fall 11%. Apple is quite good at that. So 11% pullback is, I would say it's a healthy pullback. So Microsoft is down around 13%. So that's also a decent sort of pullback. Maybe there's an opportunity for a bounce. We'll talk about that. And at the moment you can see that the price remains below the daily and 20 EMA, and they're beginning to kind of curl and move to the downside. Momentum indicators are also weak. You can see MACD has crossed below the zero line, still moving lower. I'm not seeing any kind of turn. RSI is now below the 50 level. So overall price action is weak on a daily basis. Momentum indicators are weak. Having said that, they're oversold. RSI is now close to 38.2. So this is a fib level. You see this line right here, 38.2. So let's see whether this level provides some kind of a support for a bounce. Now if there is a bounce, I want to see whether or not it can reclaim the RSI 50 level. You can see RSI 50 level was a support right here. So only if it reclaims the 50 level, that would indicate to me that momentum is shifting. As long as RSI remains below the 50 level, it means that the momentum indicators momentum is still negative. And if there is a bounce, you want to see whether or not it kind of turns and starts to move higher. So if it does something like this, that's good. And you want to see whether the price can reclaim the moving averages. So those would be the things I'm looking for on a daily basis to see if, let's say, either the price action now starts to look more positive and momentum. If I look at the weekly chart of Microsoft, so what do I see? So on a weekly basis, you can see that it's been pulling back. So I see 1, 2, 3, 4 weekly candles, okay, and then it's now pulled back to the weekly 20 EMA. The weekly 20 EMA is around 319. So it closed at 321. So it's close to that level. And you can see that, like Apple, you can see that from time to time it does pull back to the weekly 20, as was the case after the COVID sell-off. So you can see that when it was rebounding from COVID sell-off, number of times it touched the weekly 20. So this would be one area of interest, and it's almost there. Now if it wants to have a deeper pullback and go to the weekly 50, it can do that, but that would be a deeper pullback. I mean, I wouldn't expect it to fall that far, especially on an uptrend. You don't see, you see that the weekly 20 does provide good support level. You can see that RSI, which was in overbought area, has been pulling back. It's now approaching the 50 level. This RSI 50 is a very, very important level. You can see it acted as a support there. And, if you look to the left, in 2022, it was a resistance. So, so you don't want to see it fall below the 50 and hang around below the 50. That's a no-no. So looking at the price action and the momentum indicators on a weekly basis, I'm not seeing any serious breakdown at the moment. The weekly 20, I was expecting that because it does have a history of touching that level. So I'm not surprised that it has pulled back to this level. So let's see whether it can find some kind of a base right here and then move higher in coming weeks. So weekly time frame, you can see that all of the momentum indicators which were overbought are beginning to reset. So on a weekly time frame, I'm not seeing anything that concerns me at this point. Now, going forward, it doesn't mean that, what if it falls? Well, then obviously we adjust our view of the, on a weekly time frame, but we're not there yet. As long as these levels hold, I think Microsoft is fine. So as I said, it's oversold, due for a bounce. When there is a bounce, I want to see the quality of the bounce. I want to see if RSI can reclaim the 50, MACD can start to get back above the zero line. If so, then all good. Let's look at NVIDIA. So NVIDIA, obviously, it has now started to pull back. So let's see how much is it down so far. If we look at NVIDIA, so it's down around 15% from the top. So, decent, but, given the fact that it has rallied so much, maybe 15% is not deep enough. Okay, so let's have a look at the price action. You can clearly see that series of lower highs are beginning to come through. Before that, it was making higher highs, but we're beginning to see, we can see that the price has closed below both the daily 20 and 50 EMA. The daily 20 did provide support previously, but it has now broken below that level. So you can see on a daily time frame, price action is now beginning to look a little bit weak. If you look at the MACD is moving lower. It's now, approaching the zero line. So the question is whether it's gonna fall below the zero line. If so, then I would expect further weakness. But if it turns right here, then maybe we could see some kind of a temporary bounce. So we need to see what happens. You can see RSI is weak. RSI has finally broken this week below the 50 level. You can see that, since it crossed above the 50 level, so let's just right here. So it has crossed above the 50 level right here in early 2023, and it's been above that level throughout. And during that time, you see very strong price action. So when RSI is above the 50 level, in whatever time frame, daily, weekly, monthly, the case may be, you generally should see positive price action. And that's why now we're seeing selling momentum increase. So definitely it's looking weak right now. And it's no different than Apple, Microsoft. It's also going through its consolidation. Now, if I look at NVIDIA on a weekly basis, so on a weekly basis, you can see two red candles. And then you're now seeing price moving towards the weekly moving averages, the weekly 20 and the 50. You can see that, this pullback hasn't violated anything. At least it hasn't pushed it below the weekly 20. The weekly 20 are still rising. But it still remains above the weekly 20. Whereas the weekly 20, it's around 375. So if it were to come and touch the weekly 20, that means there's still a bit of a room for it to pull back. If you look to the left, you can see that it does have a history of touching the weekly 20 and 50. You can see touch here, touch here. Even on the downside, when it was rebounding, the weekly 20 acted as resistance, acted as a resistance. So, if it wants to, so I definitely see that there is more room for it to pull back, maybe to the weekly 20 right here. The other thing I will mention is that on a weekly basis, you see the gap between these two moving average is widening. So generally, when you see them widen, usually there is a correction, and and then that correction basically narrows the two moving averages. You can see right here when the gap started to widen, we see a correction down to the weekly 50. Now, I'm not saying that it will happen, but I think that there is risk, at least on a weekly time frame, because whenever something goes up too much away from the average, usually you see like a big drop. What I mean by that is this. I'll show you. This is SMCI. If you look at SMCI, it started to rally very hard and move away from the moving averages. and then this happened. This is the weekly candle. It was down almost 25%, and it's still above the weekly 50. So the weekly moving averages are like an equilibrium level. So whenever price goes away from these moving averages, eventually they will come back down. When, not sure, but it will happen. So always pay attention to where the price is in relation to moving averages. When you see that they've started to move away, then you want to be a little bit careful that something will trigger and it will pull back to those moving averages. So at the moment, I'm still seeing it's well above the 20 EMA. The other thing is that the gap between them is still quite large. So I would be a little bit cautious on Nvidia. But there's no, but that doesn't mean that you short it and you expect it to fall to this level. No, it's just mentioning it so that that even if it does pull back, that we shouldn't be surprised. But I'm not seeing any kind of breakdown at the moment. You can see RSI was way overbought, and now it's pulling back towards the 50 level. As long as RSI 50 level is held, I think this consolidation is healthy. It's bringing it back towards these averages, which are like an equilibrium level. So let's look at some of the levels that we should be paying attention. Those are the long-term levels, but we need to trade. So if we're trading, what are some of the levels? So the first level I'm looking at is 400 right here. So which is why 400? So it traded between these two zones, right? This is 440, this is 480. So it traded within a 40-point zone. Now that it has broken below, a full measured move of this range projects a target to 400. So this is another 400 point, $40 point. So that's the first level I'm looking at. Second level is obviously these levels right here. So this is 375. This is basically where the weekly 20 is sitting. So if you look at the weekly, see right there is the weekly 20. That's 375. So so if it pulls back to these levels, that's where the 375 is. I mean, this is an area of interest. I mean, it doesn't mean that it falls straight through. It doesn't mean that. It means that it could do this, and then it could do something like this, and so forth. Also, Nvidia reports earnings on when is it? 23rd. So just be aware of it. So maybe the earnings may be the catalyst that leads to a decent pullback. But on the other hand, it could also mean that it rises sharply. Look at the big gap after the earnings, right? Maybe the earnings fills the gap, or maybe the earnings creates another gap. Like Meta, we'll discuss Meta. You'll see there are two big gaps. So just because there's a gap right here, people look at this gap and say, hey, that's where it's going. Well, maybe not. Maybe this gap will be filled at some point in the future. Maybe it may never be filled. We don't know. Just because there's a gap doesn't mean that it's going there. But I would say that there is risk in Nvidia based on what I'm seeing on a weekly and a weekly time frame, because it's still above the weekly moving averages. And generally, when you see something like this, eventually, something will trigger and it will, come and touch these levels. When that happens, nobody knows, but just be aware of it. So that's Nvidia. 400 is my near-time level I'm watching. And if 400 level is breached, then 375. On the upside, 400 is now the resistance. Having fallen below, you can see the daily 20 EMA is around, 440 is the resistance. Sorry, what I'm saying, 440. You can see the daily 20 EMA is around 440 level. So it is entirely possible that maybe there is a bounce up to this level and then we could have another leg down. So it's, so once 440 gets taken out, then obviously things start to change. Also, on a daily basis, what you want to see is, okay, what happens to the these RSI? Does RSI reclaim the 50 level? If so, then obviously you can't have a negative bias. If RSI gets back above 50, then obviously you have to start, thinking more on the long side. And if you see that MACD started to turn and moving higher, then your view should change to more on the long side than on the short side. All right, moving on to Tesla. So Tesla. So just like others, price action is weak. You can see gradually moving lower below the daily 20 and 50. MACD is now crossing below the zero line, RSI, all that stuff. So, I'm not going to go through it. You can see that it's weak, but oversold. RSI is now around 38 level. You can see stochastic is oversold. So due for a bounce. On a weekly basis, what do I see? I see pullback, few weeks of consolidation. It's pulling back towards the weekly 20 and 50 EMA. It's also pulling back towards this breakout level. So, as long as price remains above these, I don't see a problem with this. Maybe this is gonna create another weekly higher low. So since forming this low, here's a weekly higher low, and this could be a weekly higher low. So I'm not seeing a breakdown in structure. Yeah, it remains above the moving average. RSI remains above 50, and MACD remains above. So on a weekly basis, I'm not seeing anything. This consolidation to me looks quite healthy after this big run up. If you look at this run up, pull back, run up, pull back, it's making progress. Making progress meaning the lows are higher than the previous. So I think this is progress. If I see that, if I see something like this where it makes a lower high, that would concern me. Or if RSI were to fall below the 50 level and remains 50 level, that would be concerning on a weekly basis. Or if MACD crosses and falls below the zero line, that would be concerning. But we don't have it at the moment. At the moment, all I'm seeing is some sort of a pullback to known area of support, the moving averages. So so I think this is very healthy. And then if there is a bounce, then let's have a look to see the quality of the bounce. Does that take out this level, or does that create a lower high? If that's the case, then we'll reassess. But at the moment, I'm seeing consolidation, and it's very consistent with what we've seen with other stocks and previous price action in Tesla. So again, when there is a bounce, I want to see whether RSI on a daily basis can really reclaim the 50 level. I want to see whether MACD can start to cross and move higher. Like you want to see MACD cross like that and starts to move higher. You want to see whether price can reclaim. If so, then obviously on a daily basis, things will start to look much better. But we're not there yet. So when that happens, we'll see it in price action, and accordingly we'll look to the long side. But at the moment, bias is still to the downside, only because but you don't want to short at this level. No, because Tesla is down almost 20% from the high. You don't want to short here because there is an opportunity for at least a oversold bounce. So I don't want to short here. I want to see if there is a bounce, the quality of the bounce, and then assess it from then at that point. So that's my view on Tesla. So lastly, I'm going to look at Meta. So very strong looking chart on a daily basis. Now, if I look at it's pulled back around roughly 8%. 8% now, much less than Tesla's 20%, Nvidia's 15%, Apple we saw 11%, Microsoft we saw around 13-14%. So this is held up much better. So let's have a quick look at price action. Very strong looking chart. It's just closed slightly below the daily 20 EMA, but remains above the daily 50. All the other stocks we've seen, they've broken below both the daily 20 and 50, but Meta hasn't. But I am seeing some weakness creeping in. The momentum indicators are beginning to move lower. You can see MACD is heading lower, but it still remains above the zero line. RSI closed just below the 50 level. You can see that 50 level acted as a support here and here. here. Since from this point forward, you can see that this is the first time it has dipped below the 50 level. So there is some weakness, but overall this chart looks still quite strong. Now, but if RSI continues to drift lower, then maybe we can see a bigger pullback. But overall, I would say this is still healthy looking. Now, let's have a look at the weekly chart of Meta. Now, this is where I think we need to kind of, think about the chart a little bit. Very strong looking weekly chart. Now, I'm not seeing too much of a structure because, after this rally, there was some pullback to this weekly 50, and then it is just gone. It hasn't pulled back. It hasn't gone through a meaningful pullback. We see two weekly red candles, but those two red candles are smaller than this one big green candle. And then if you look at where price is in relation, it's still above the two moving averages. Overall, this is a very strong looking weekly chart. There's no question about it. RSI remains well above the 50, so there's nothing negative I see about the weekly chart. Now, that said, if you look at the price is well above the weekly 20 and 50 EMA. We know that from time to time it does pull back to the weekly 20 EMA at least. You can see after the COVID weekly 20. So here we see it touch the weekly 50. So here we see weekly 50. So if I go even further, you will see touches of weekly 20 or 50. But it hasn't done so, in this rally ever since this rally started. So it hasn't. So where's the weekly 20? Weekly 20 is around 267. So there's still quite a bit of daylight between the current price and the weekly 20. So this is worth keeping an eye on. And I would say that weekly RSI is still in an overbought level, remains well above the 50, but you can see that it started to make lower highs. So just be aware of it. So I think there is an opportunity for further pullback. Even if there is further pullback, I don't think it's gonna break the weekly structure at all, because I think even if it pulls back to the weekly 20, the moving it will still be above the moving averages. If it does something like this, then this becomes the weekly higher low. But I do see that because it hasn't had a deeper correction, just like let's say Apple or Microsoft, Tesla, Nvidia, there is an opportunity here. I think we need to be a little bit careful with Meta here. When that happens, nobody knows, but something will trigger at some point, and that's when, because we know that these things happen, right? You don't see price keeps going up, and if it keeps going up, then then one day what's gonna happen is that something negative will come in, and we're gonna see candle like this on SMCI. I'm not saying that that's gonna happen now, but I think we just want to be aware of where the current price is in relation to these averages, because these averages, they act like magnets. Prices do pull back to these, and the further away from these averages they are, the bigger the fall when it happens. But I'm not saying that it's going to happen right now, but it's something to keep something to be aware of. If you look at the monthly chart, you can see that very strong rally without any kind of pause. So we should be prepared. Should something negative happen. Now you can see that there are a couple of gaps right here which are yet to be filled. Not suggesting that they go to that level, but I would be a little bit cautious. Now, but the daily chart remains quite weak. If it weakens further, the first level I would look at is this 50-day moving average. So let's look at the 50-day moving averages right now is around 307, and also this low right here, the previous swing low. I think this level is around 280. Let's confirm that. 288, and then the daily 50 EMA is 307. And below that, obviously, we have to reassess. But those would be the two near-term levels I'm looking at. And also, I'm curious to see whether it can reclaim the RSI 50 level, or if it spends more time, then I would favor the downside. Initially, you can start to see that it's beginning to put in lower high on a daily basis. So there's some weakness, beginning to come through. The question is, if it does that, it could very well do something like this. But at this point, this one has the best looking chart of all of them. All right, I'll leave it at that. I thank you very much for watching the video. So please consider subscribing or following me on Twitter. Thank you.